Rise and shine, it's game day. Gonna give it all, come what may. Fueling up with the best in mind. DHA's the secret that you'll find.
Hello, I'm Bassam Hallak from Omega Ingredients, and welcome to our podcast series where we dive into the latest in sports science and nutrition from a DHA's perspective. In our last podcast, Greg provided insights into the impact of omega-3 fatty acids and its impact on the training and competing in sports and exercise. Today, we're exploring the impact of omega-3 fatty acids and its impact on training and competing for masters athletes. Joining us today is Dr. Greg Peoples from the University of Wollongong, who has conducted pivotal research on this topic. Hello, Greg, and welcome back.
Hi, Bassam. What's this, number 5 already?
Number
Time
five.
flies.
Time flies when you're having fun. Well, we're going to talk about masters athletes today. Clearly, you and I have talked a lot, and we're both
I think we're both masters
masters
athletes.
So, just for sake of definition, what are master athletes and how do their physical and training recovery needs differ from those that are of younger athletes?
Yeah, so look, by definition, and obviously depending on where you are internationally, masters athlete are generally regarded as those over the age of 35, which is fascinating because we're both well and truly there, aren't we? And so competitions will
35.
35. Competitions will refer to masters competitions for
Yeah.
the 35 to 40s and so on. But look, if we think of it generally in terms of healthy aging, what we know is that, and it kind of line up, doesn't it? We've got sort of peak physiological function in our 20s and our 30s, whether that's peak strength, peak power, peak aerobic capacity. And from that point on, depending on who you are, there is an age-related decline in our body systems. So it may be your lung function, your maximal heart rate, your VO2 max, and as I said, your power and your strength. Now we can modify that, and I think it's an important part, isn't it? Because we often think of normal aging referring to most of the population. Now, most of the population don't meet the physical activity guidelines.
Mm.
So when we refer to normal aging and normal decline in physical function, we should actually be looking at the masters athlete who takes part in physical activity on a daily basis, achieves the guidelines, probably exceeds the guidelines, and therefore maintains an optimal physical capacity into their 40s, 50s, 60s, 80s, and then 90s. So that should be seen as normal aging rather than what we often refer to, which is those that don't take part in physical activity. So I think that's an important thing to think about first. But if you then flip that on its head to say, well, if that's normal aging and physical activity is important to sustain physiological function of all of our body systems, then obviously taking part in physical activity has its stresses, but obviously that keeps us strong and healthy. And at the same time, we need to be able to recover. Recovering and being able to do that over and over again can become a little bit more challenging for someone who's in their 70s or their 80s. So it's fantastic when we see masters competitions where we do have the 85-year-old running the 200 meters or the 100 meters. That's great. But the chances are it probably is going to take a little bit more toll on their body compared to when they were back in their 20s. And so being able to support that physiological recovery through a range of different means, and nutrition is ultimately very important for the older athlete. So even if you take it from the perspective of maintaining a good healthy diet for normal healthy aging, we know that there are challenges for older adults in terms of meeting daily energy requirements, keeping protein intake up. And then the idea that omega-3s could play a really important role is actually a really fascinating topic, because again, it goes back to the idea that we've been talking about the whole time. The general population don't take in enough omega-3s, EPA or DHA, and so it's logical that older adults are unlikely to be consuming enough of these two preformed omega-3 fatty acids.
Yeah. So, like in the broader sense of omega-3 and healthy aging, what do we already know from the literature in terms of increased dietary intake of omega-3 fatty acids and the improved health outcomes, especially when it relates to the physical function?
For an aging
Yes,
person?
correct, yeah.
So look, it's on my bucket list. We haven't done a lot of studies, or internationally we haven't done a lot of studies using masters athletes where we've looked at the role of omega-3. So when we're talking about an older adult consuming omega-3 and whether it's useful, the majority of the adults in the population generally maybe or maybe not just meeting physical activity guidelines. So we've got at least 20 odd studies that exist that have supplemented older adults with omega-3 and looked at a range of different outcomes across different body systems. So, for an older adult, it's about activities of daily living, it's about physical function, it's about maintaining strength and power and agility and all of these things. But if I just take a step back, if we think about, before we go on to RCTs and talk about, providing omega-3 and saying whether it's a benefit, if we have a look at cohort studies to start, and what we mean by that is if we look at populations that have, by nature, through potentially cultural based dietary intake, taken in omega-3s because it's part of the cultural aspect to their diet. So we're thinking Mediterranean diet as a good example there. There's some nice studies that show from those that consume more omega-3s, EPA, DHA, and we're talking generally whole food sources like marine-based fish, for example, and then look at the relationship between physical function and those omega-3s. There seems to be some really nice evidence at that population level that the ability to maintain some walking speed, for example, or lower limb power is maintained in those adults that are taking omega-3s through their everyday diet, and the Mediterranean diet is a good example. The Inchianti study comes to mind. They studied 90-year-olds and looked at their intake in the last decade of their life or two, and demonstrated quite clearly that the older 90-year-olds that were taking in more preformed EPA and DHA had better lower limb function compared to those that were taking in less EPA. So that we can translate that back to say there's something in this. There's something for us to be thinking about how important these two fatty acids are for supporting physical activity and therefore keeping people active as they want to train as a masters athlete.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about an aging person with regards to DHA, it's always been connected to heart. But what are the specific benefits for omega-3 for a masters athlete, specifically in terms of muscle function and overall performance?
Yeah, so if you think about muscle function, obviously as we age, we lose muscle mass. So terms like atrophy come to mind. And obviously when we engage in physical activity, it actually tries to alleviate atrophy because of the mechanical stimulus that we're giving the muscle at the same time. But if we think about the role of DHA then incorporating into muscle fibers according to whether it's a slow twitch muscle fiber, a fast twitch muscle fiber, a fast twitch oxidative muscle fiber, then as we age, we generally do lose power as well. We generally do lose contractile force as we age. And we know that DHA in particular incorporates into skeletal muscle fibers at very high incorporation rates, even compared to EPA. And if we look across, and sorry, I'm going to jump across species here, but if we look across species, we see a very strong evidence for when muscle fibers need to repeat contraction over and over again in different animal groups, DHA banks and incorporates higher into those muscle fibers. So the hummingbird that moves its muscles very quickly, or the rattlesnake tail that moves its tail very quickly, has high levels of DHA. So we can see from a biological point of view how important that is. So if we bring that back to human muscle, and human muscle where we're wanting to maintain its function for as long as possible, it's logical that we'd be better off making sure that the DHA levels are incorporated as high as possible as we age. I know I'd prefer to have more DHA in my muscle than less DHA as an option.
Well, clearly, I mean, from the insights you've given us so far, I just want to turn to the review study. So your recent study discusses the potential application of fish oil for healthy aging. Can you summarize the key findings related to omega-3 fatty acids and their impact on masters athletes as detailed in your study?
Yeah, so this was a study that one of our master's students conducted a couple of years ago. And they weren't masters athletes per se, but they were meeting physical activity guidelines. And we supplemented them with a DHA-rich fish oil. And this one, we actually went for 16 weeks. We thought it was really important to make sure that the older adults in the study were given as best opportunity to incorporate as much DHA as possible. So knowing that minimum of 8 weeks, but we can reach good sort of peak levels within 12 for a given amount of dose.
Is the absorption of omega-3 is it harder as you get older?
So that was part of the in saying that we wouldn't know exactly which of our participants may or may not have
Okay.
gastrointestinal issues,
Yeah,
we
yeah.
thought let's give them as long as possible
Fair enough.
exposure.
Yep.
And we took, again, we've always talked about having a biomarker, so we took the omega-3 index and we made sure that that omega-3 index was raised. And we gave them, so back down at our doses, we provided them with 500 to 600 milligrams of DHA, and there was a little bit of EPA sitting in the background because it was a tuna fish oil that we were using in that instance. And we allowed them to incorporate that, and their omega-3 index was increased, and we got that up towards 8%. We've talked about 8% being kind
Yep.
of the minimum target that we should
Yep.
reach. What we looked at in this particular trial is then we assessed before and after the DHA intervention. We assessed their physical capacity, physical function. We put them on a treadmill, measured their oxygen consumption. We looked at their heart rate. We also did a walking test with them as well, measured lower limb strength. And then we brought them back 16 weeks later and we repeated those assessments. Now, what was interesting, and this sort of gets into the idea of when we age, obviously some adults their physical function is very low. Some adults, their physical function is meeting kind of minimum requirements, and then we've got our masters athletes that are probably exceeding minimum requirements. Our group was a group that were kind of just meeting physical requirements, so they were healthy and active, let's call them. So they came back and they repeated all their physical capacity assessments. And what we noticed overall is that we didn't see a change in strength, or we didn't see a change in power. But when they were doing those activities, what was interesting is their heart rate response, and we've talked about this before, their heart rate response was lower for a given amount of physical exertion that they were putting out. So when they're performing their walking activities, for example, they were doing that with a lower heart rate. This is an interesting point because we haven't really touched on this. When we talked about heart rate response being lower in the younger adult, one thing that we do know as we age, our maximal or peak heart rate actually falls, doesn't it? So we can't reach that. So if we can lower our heart rate to do daily activities of living or perform walking tasks, or if you're a masters athlete, perform the event that you want to take part in, then if you can lower that submaximal heart rate, it means that you've got more space between that and your age-related decline peak heart rate. Because maybe you've only got a peak heart rate of 160 now.
Yeah, well, especially in endurance sport, you don't want to be training at maximum heart rate, right?
That's right.
So if you could train harder but at a lower heart rate, it's going to be beneficial during your training.
Yeah, so it best summarizes we didn't see any changes in their physical capacity. They maintained them, but they've achieved those at a lower heart rate. So that was the outcome that we saw in our study.
Yeah, okay. Can we just move on to the mechanisms of the action of omega-3 in masters athletes? How do omega-3 fatty acids influence muscle protein synthesis in particular, and then muscle mass in older adults? I think we talked about that in a previous podcast. And what are the mechanisms involved in that?
Yeah, so in terms of the most studied area of omega-3s and older adults, it certainly has been muscle mass, muscle health overall. And as I mentioned, primarily the studies have taken part with older adults in their 70s and 80s, not necessarily meeting physical activity guidelines. So we've seen a range of different outcomes. And so what we've observed in the literature is that there is some studies that have said that muscle mass improves and muscle protein synthesis goes up. And there's other studies that said, well, we haven't sort of observed a change. And so this is an interesting sort of dissection then in terms of, well, what omega-3s were provided, how many milligrams of EPA and DHA existed in that, and how long did that occur for? And importantly, some of the studies also combined it with resistance training, which then sort of increases the idea of the combined effect of omega-3 and resistance training at the same time. So I think we best summarize where we are at the moment for older adults is that there is some evidence for omega-3 to support the muscle protein synthesis pathway. And Chris McGlory's done a lot of work on this already, but it's contextual. It doesn't happen all the time. It is a combination also. Are the older adults also meeting their amino acid intake recommendations or their protein intake recommendations?
Yeah.
And so the resulting differences in the studies that we're seeing sometimes is because some studies are exceeding amino acid intake and others are not providing enough, and you can then get a resultant difference in terms of the muscle protein synthesis. But I think an interesting area is this relationship between muscle protein synthesis and breakdown. So as we age, we're obviously increasing the breakdown side
Yeah.
as much. And again, if I sort of just a shout out to Chris McGlory's group here, they've done some interesting work in terms of looking at very acute muscle unloading activities where they've provided omega-3 prior to casting up a limb. So, when you have a cast, you pull the cast off afterwards, your muscle mass has gone down. So
Yeah.
you pretty much enter a state of muscle protein breakdown. And so
Yeah.
you end up with muscle atrophy afterwards. So Chris produced a really nice study where he provided omega-3, and it was quite a substantial amount, several thousand milligrams, prior to casting up limbs in a female cohort. And then they took the cast off afterwards, and they also assessed the amount of degradation of muscle protein that occurred. And lo and behold, those on the omega-3 had managed, but both groups obviously then lose muscle mass. You can't stop that, but there was less effect in those that had been previously provided omega-3 compared to not. So that's a translatable outcome. I think that'll be important for masters athletes, particularly if you think about an older person. They might not be able to sustain the physical training day in, day out the whole year. And there may be periods where they unload and then load, they have some time off, they come back to sport. Having that background of omega-3 can also then provide opportunities to support muscle health in times where they're not meeting physical activity guidelines as much as when they are.
Yeah. And we talk about muscle health, and we talk about, okay, inflammation, right? I mean, that's the first thing that happens when you exercise. So can you explain in this case the role of omega-3 when it comes to inflammation and oxidative stress, and how these factors affect recovery and performance for these master athletes?
So in the previous chat we had, we sort of talked very specifically about the acute response to exercise, creating inflammation, and omega-3 is helping to support the immediate cleanup of that inflammation afterwards. For an older adult, it might mean that there is increased chance for cells to be exposed to chronic inflammation, and so that is part of the natural process of pathophysiology, isn't it? So what we see is that as we age, our ability to deal with inflammation becomes less, our ability to resolve inflammation becomes less capable. And so opportunities then to provide omega-3 through those two different mechanistic pathways we talked about before, EPA with its characteristics of derivatives that are anti-inflammatory, but importantly DHA with its derivatives of pro-resolvent. If both those fatty acids are present for older adults across multiple body tissues, the chances are that those two pathways can be activated on an ongoing basis to at least alleviate the buildup of inflammation that can occur or is more likely to occur as we age. So again, it's an area that we probably need to progress a lot more into, and it's masters athletes are actually going to provide a really good opportunity to do this. As I said, there's not many studies, if any, at this stage that have actually looked at this particular topic. So I think it will be something that should be looked at in the next decade. And when I say masters athletes, it's not just the over 35s. I think we should be looking primarily at sort of the 65 to 85-year-old category, and older adults that really do want to engage in some fairly serious physical activity. And then we can look more closely across all those body systems that we're talking about, heart, muscle, brain, on how that can help support those older adults that want to be really engaged in physical activity as they age.
Well, I mean, if you look at from the market right now, there's a serious problem with birth rate, right? You're probably aware of it. So there's no doubt that the majority of the Western world is actually an aging population. Europe's average age is 45, Japan's at 47. Australia's fast approaching 40 years old. So there's certainly, that's where the focus should be. So in terms of mastered athletes looking to incorporate omega-3, what would you recommend in terms of dosage and the types of omega-3 they should take? EPA, DHA, in terms of to help them with their active lifestyle or their, what they're training for, whether it be a triathlete or a marathon or whatever.
Yeah. So again, if we cut it back to an older adult engaging in normal Western style diet, we can make some assumptions that they're probably taking in 150 or 200 milligrams per day of combined EPA and DHA, just like for instance, we're here in Australia, so most of the Australian population are probably sitting that. So unless an older adult has engaged in, um, a cultural-based food intake of, say, marine products, they've probably got an omega-3 index that are between 4 and 5%. We know that's a suboptimal. Where are we trying to head? We've talked about this before. We would like most adults to aim for an omega-3 index of over 8%. How does an older adult get there? Well, in theory, there's no difference to a younger adult. We still need to try and meet some minimum requirements. So we've talked about previously, the first target that people should be looking at is 500 milligrams per day. In terms of a balance, I think it's probably quite logical to think about, well, the omega-3 index, muscle, heart, brain, is more likely to preferentially incorporate DHA.
Yeah.
So being able to provide of that 500 milligrams a higher proportion of DHA to the 500, that would be a good thing. We also know that EPA is probably not being taken in, and there's a logical reason why an older adult should also be thinking about EPA, but the EPA doesn't need to make up the bulk amount of that omega-3 intake. We can quite easily, move EPA levels up from, we can double EPA levels up in a red blood cell by providing probably an extra 200 milligrams. So if we summarize that up, if we take in an extra 500 or 600 total, and the higher proportion of that is DHA with a smaller proportion of EPA, most adults would be able to move their omega-3 index by 2 or 2.5%.
Yeah.
Obviously, if they start low, they probably need to be taking in a little bit more. And we've talked about trying to achieve 1,000 in the short term before coming back onto a maintenance 500 milligrams. And that would sort of substantiate, an 8% in the long term. Obviously, the complexities of the older gastrointestinal tract, the absorption, just like muscle function goes down, our gut function goes down as well. So it's really important that the older adult then engages in that omega-3 intake with whole foods rather than on an empty stomach, for example. It's too easy just to, reach for the supplement capsule and take it on an empty stomach.
Yeah.
I think it's important that.
So what would you suggest? If a master athlete came to you and said, "Okay, I want to increase my omega-3 index to 8," what would be the dietary source of omega-3 that you would suggest to them?
Look, if someone's happy to engage in a marine-based sources to start with, there are some potential. And look, let's take tin tuna as an example. It's actually a really interesting topic, tin tuna, because it's also providing some protein.
Yeah.
And so it's a nice source of both omega-3 and protein, and we know that older adults should be focusing on both of those things.
Yeah.
So if an older adult is happy to take in, for example, a tin marine product like tuna, and that can be done several times per week, well, that you're partway there. And then it's looking about what you can add on top of the end, and then look to say, okay, once I look at all my whole foods, how many supplement DHA EPA milligrams do I need on top of that overall? And the reason why I bring up the example of tuna, we've previously worked with contact sport athletes where we've compared within the same squad males and females. Now, what was interesting is the male athletes came out with a higher omega. This is before any supplementation, no education, not really telling them anything about omega-3. The male athletes came out with a higher omega-3 index than the female athletes. And it's like, okay, what's going on here? Because there's been conversations about, is there a difference between males and females? Is there a difference between those that are physically active and not physically active? So we just stick with the males and females. Now, what we notice, it wasn't a sex-based reason. If we then look through the dietary records, all the male rugby league players were all eating canned tuna. And the females weren't.
Well, they weren't, okay.
So the males were 2% higher. They had an omega-3 index of around about 6.5. The females were back at 4.5, simply because there was this constant. Now, if you ask those players, why are you eating your tuna? They didn't eat it for omega-3. They were eating it for protein.
For protein.
So if you come back to the older adult, something as simple as canned tuna is actually a really good protein source, doubled down with an omega-3 source at the same time. And sure, we don't, everyone will get sick of eating tuna every day. So It's not about eating tuna every day a week, but it's looking for what parts of the diet
Yeah.
are already going to provide me with some omega-3? How
Yeah.
much omega-3 is that? And how much extra do I need to potentially get through a supplemental source if needed?
Yeah. With the research in master athletes and younger athletes, did you see a difference? I mean, was there a difference in the impact of omega-3 in each of the groups?
In terms of uptake, so we've done a few older studies now with a DHA rich oil and plenty of younger studies with a DHA rich oil.
Yeah.
We saw no difference in the omega-3
Uptake, so
index uptake. So it's not to say that, and they were healthy older adults.
Yeah.
I think that the issue will be is if you're then an older adult with gastrointestinal challenges or discomforts or absorption issues, then potentially obviously working with a dietitian, for example, around holistic foods that help support dietary absorption will be critical for that. But I think it also boils back to the idea that it's not solving it by simply putting a supplement into an empty stomach. It needs to be a presentation of EPA and DHA preformed with the rest of the diet, so the gastrointestinal tract can identify that there's some EPA and DHA that need to be absorbed into the bloodstream.
So then, so what are some of the misconceptions or challenges regarding omega-3 supplementation for older athletes? And how can this be overcome? I mean, there seems to be, I don't know. Do you see that they don't want to use it, or what's some of the misconceptions that you see?
Yeah, look, I think there's a couple of interesting topics that get debated quite regularly. One is, and we've mentioned this before, the idea that if we uptake a huge amount of omega-3 into the diet, our bleeding time is going to be affected. And we know that older adults potentially can be affected by bruising, for example. So I think it's a real conversation that older adults need to then have with the relevant clinician around the entire cardiovascular system. But I guess it also boils back to the idea that we don't need to be taking in thousands and thousands of milligrams. It's that consistency of the 500 to 1,000 milligrams means that we're not over presenting the amount of EPA, for example, that's related to the anti-aggregation that we see in terms of the platelet function. The other interesting part that has been and look, just a comment on the bleeding, and Bill Harris has done some Professor Bill Harris from the States has done some nice studies looking at this, is that the idea that if omega-3 affects the blood characteristics, including bleeding time, that can be of negative potential for some people. They've actually looked at some transfusion studies and found from a surgical point of view that those on omega-3 need less transfusions afterwards. So sometimes our perceived conception around the negative effects of too much omega-3 doesn't actually play out if you look at the literature from the point of view of, say, dietary achievable intake, as opposed to a therapeutic massive doses and the relevance in terms of what an adult actually needs. The other one that comes up a little bit is whether or not there's a relationship between omega-3 intake and atrial fib, AF. And there are studies that have pointed to the idea that increased omega-3 increased a relative risk of experiencing AF. And look, we know that AF is quite prevalent in our populations, and it becomes more obvious in older groups of adults. And that's because the heart ages, becomes a little bit more fibrotic. Areas of the heart that need to coordinate that electrical activity aren't quite working as well as what they should in terms of being able to coordinate the electrical impulses around the heart. And so AF is a factor for an older adult. But again, if we look at the literature around there is some papers that suggest increased omega-3 results in increased risk of AF, but there's also a decent amount of papers that say that within reason, if you're just taking the dietary achievable amounts, that risk doesn't necessarily play out to be as high as what some papers have suggested that would be. So again, it's a matter of then looking and talking to the clinician to say, I'd like to engage in omega-3s. What's my cardiovascular health look? Am I at risk of AF? And should that be a consideration? But again, I would emphasize that not every study has clearly showed that the increased risk of AF is there. But both from a bleeding point of view and an AF point of view, an older adult should engage with either their dietitian or clinician around that personal conversation.
Yep. I mean, I already just mentioned that the world's becoming it's aging very fast. So in terms of future directions, in terms of research, what are the gaps in the current research regarding omega-3 with aging athletes and even aging, human beings, really.
Yeah. So it brings our conversation around to the observational work that we can see from the larger studies where preformed EPA and DHA, when taken in over a lifetime, becomes an important. So it's not that if you're 85 and you haven't been taking omega-3, oh, well, it's not worth my time now. Well, it's still worth your time. But reality is, I think we should be treating it as something that we see as supporting us for lifespan rather than just simply, oh, I need to take this now because it's going to fix X, Y, Z, whether it's heart function, muscle function, brain function. So from an aging perspective, I would like to see educational programs put in place that emphasize how important it is to setting ourselves up for what we are now in our 30s and 40s. That actually then influences how we're going to arrive in our 70s and 80s. So just like we treat physical activities, you can't just turn around and become physically active in your 80s and it's going to solve all your problems. You need to engage in that physical activity through our lifespan. So I think it's the same rule for nutrition, and then I think it's the same rule for EPA and DHA in particular, that it has to be engaged in for the lifespan to get the most benefit for when we're older. Does that make sense?
And so if I was to give you a magic wand, how would you envisage the role of omega-3 evolving in terms of in the field of medicine, sports medicine in particular, and aging, over the next decade? What would you like to see different?
I'd certainly like to see an emphasis more on, I think within reason, there's been a lot of focus on cardiovascular function. So I'd like to see more emphasis on muscle function. And as I said, Chris McGlory has been doing some good work out of North America on that. And there's been several other research groups that have worked particularly on the muscle atrophy, muscle protein synthesis, muscle breakdown. So I think more work could be done on that, because frailty is obviously going to be, or is, one of our major concerns that we're experiencing as a population, and frailty then leads to a lot of other exacerbated outcomes and therefore cost essentially for our populations. But I'd also like to see a lot more work done on how it could support the cognitive side of healthy aging. So we know that obviously dementia and Alzheimer's, for example, are going to be two major challenges that we face, and we can definitely appreciate that DHA in particular has really important roles in early child development. So it makes sense that why do we stop? Why aren't we continuing to recognize that DHA is just going to be important?
I think dementia just overtook heart disease as a major killer in Australia.
That's right. And look, there's a beautiful intersection then, because obviously there's vascular related dementia mechanisms as well. So again, if we're looking at DHA and EPA supporting our vascular system, that can be an indirect way, as well as treating the brain cells themselves with DHA in the longer term. So I'd like to see more work on the frailty side and alleviating frailty, and then an increased emphasis around how it can support cognitive function in older adults.
Well, thank you, Greg, for joining us today and sharing your valuable insights. It's been a pleasure discussing these important findings, not only this podcast, but the last 4 as well. I hope you enjoyed it.
It's been great. Let's hope we can entice some others on, and we'll have some good conversations with many other people who are working on this important area.
Thank you for joining us on this enlightening journey through our podcast series, The Good Oil, on the role of DHA in sports science. We hope you've gained valuable insights into how this inessential nutrient can enhance performance, support active lifestyles. Remember, whether you're an elite athlete or simply looking to boost your fitness, understanding the science behind nutrition is key. We encourage you to explore the resources we've discussed and consider how they benefit you. Stay tuned for more DHA episodes, where we will continue to uncover the latest DHA science and its impact on nutrition and health. Until next time, stay healthy and keep pushing your limits.
DHA, the athlete's choice. Heart and brain, let's raise our voice. Muscle recovery will go far. With Omega-3, your shining star.